Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Right, well, it's a great pleasure to have a chance to talk to Richard Smith, who I've known for 40 years at least. Richard, tell me where and when you were born.
I was born in the village of Sybil Henningham in North Essex, although my parents were born respectively in Castle and Sybil Henningham, so they were a kind of endogamous marriage, which I've spent most of my life trying to prove is not characteristic of the English population. And my father came from Castle Henningham, which is one of the seats of the De Veres, Earls of Oxford. So I always thought that the village he came from was the one I'd really want to have been born in, and it had a status that Sybil Henningham didn't quite possess, although they both had rather interesting place names. And I'm quite sure that the Castle Henningham connection has something to do with the way my life subsequently evolved.
Really? How is that?
Well, I still remember a volume that my grandmother, who had served as a cook in the house at the castle, which was a rather grand Tudor house. She had a history of the castle, and as a sort of lad, I suppose about 7, looking at this and beginning to realise that I did live in a community that had some genuine history to it, and I'm sure it had some kind of at least indirect influence on the way I thought about things that interested me subsequently. And as a result of that, getting to know the fact that the church had an unusually early Norman nave, which I then began to recognise what sort of Romanesque architecture looked like, and going to a small country grammar school nearby. Subsequently, the fact that I had a very interesting history teacher, he was interested in the fact that I could tell him about Castle Henningham, which gave me another sort of, I think, status in the class. So there's some quite odd things that you might say grow out of that sort of early experience.
Well, we'll come back to some of those things in a minute, but you mentioned your grandparents. You got to know them, and what were they like?
Yeah, I got to know particularly my grandparents on my father's side, because my grandparent, or my grandfather on my mother's side, I only knew very, very briefly. They were in a sense sort of domestic servants in a grand house. He was a gamekeeper, and she was a cook, and they were active in the local community. They had sons and daughters who they all gave sort of French names. The family, the Magenders, who'd taken over the estate.
Yes,
yeah, you may have had.
Yeah.
There are some North Essex connections that you have too, which would have linked them with you. And as they were a French family, she decided to give her children French forenames. So I had a Muriel as an aunt, a Claude, and a Victor, and my father was Louis. Which again was slightly incongruous, really, as a set of names in North Essex, in a North Essex village at the time. But thank goodness the family discontinued that practice with my generation. I got sort of right, solid, sort of Norman names, really. But they were socialists in a sort of a very Tory community, and I'm sure that had some influence on my uncle Victor and my father, who were both very active in the local Labour Party. So the household was quite politicised. From the point of view of Labour politicians sort of popping in and out. The oddity was that, of course, it was a solidly Tory constituency, because this was Rab Butler's constituency in North Essex, a man who was greatly admired generally. Even though he had never been successful in the top echelons of the Tory party, but there was never any chance that the Labour Party would ever win this constituency. And in vain every election, the likes of Richard Crossman and Barbara Castle would sort of turn up at the village hall, and my father would have to provide tea and make them feel that they were making some sort of effort towards a socialist victory, which never happened in that constituency. But I think they were all quite interesting sort of experiences to observe as a child, particularly in an area of North Essex that was rather sleepy, to put it mildly, and one that by the time I was reaching my teens, I was only too desperate to get out of, really. Even though I had an unusually sort of lucky break in going to a small country grammar school in Earls Coombe, which the more I think about it, was really quite important. I mean, I had a history teacher, a man called Ernst Wangerman, who subsequently went on to have a chair in European history at Leeds. He had been a pupil of Christopher Hill's and had published in the Oxford series his Oxford D. Phil. And I thought that was quite exotic, really. I mean, from the point of view of the kind of teachers I'd previously known. And he was very, very encouraging, I must say, and sort of set an example. The thought of a university career and all the other things that he managed subsequently to achieve, I think, again, would have been fairly remote in that part of the world at that time.
Let's go back. We'll come back to Earls Coombe, I expect, at some point. But let's go back to your parents. What did your parents do?
My father was an apprentice joiner cabinet maker. He was a skilled craftsman, you might say, but clearly would have, I think, in a different generation, have probably been certainly a professional, I would imagine. I mean, those kinds of skills that he had as a labour agent in a constituency were, I think, indicative of that. My mother was a housewife right through her life, really, and I was an only child, which I'm sure has a lot to do with other aspects of my personality, which might emerge as we talk further. But basically was not terribly interested in my academic career. I think she would have been quite happy if I'd ended up staying in the village in North Essex, but my father was desperate for me to get out. There's no doubt about that. I mean, he probably was thinking about all the things that he didn't, achieve himself, and that I was a kind of vehicle for that.
What were their characters like?
My father was very gregarious, much more so than I am, because I'm still a relatively shy person, and my mother was a very, very timid lady who found it very difficult, I think, to talk to people who she didn't know very, very well. But my father was outward going and was a kind of group organiser, as a trade unionist and as a labour agent. I mean, he was always running meetings and felt he could talk to anybody, really, with no qualms about it, and didn't really find it difficult talking to people who were sort of socially significantly many more rungs up the ladder than he. So I'm sure, again, he set me a good example, which I think was influential in some way. But my mother was, but she was widowed very early. He died in his 50s, so she had a long period of widowhood, and
how old were you when he died?
I was in my early 20s when not young. I mean, but certainly it meant that my mother had 35 years of widowhood, which as an only child, I did find my dealings, involvement with her were often quite complicated, particularly because I was not living in North Essex, but getting married in the United States, and then coming back, oddly enough, to Cambridge initially, which meant that I was very, very close physically. It wasn't very far from here to Sybil Hedingham. I mean,
did you say when you were born? What date?
I was born in 46.
46.
I think I must have been conceived on VE night. It looks like pretty much close to sort of sometime in early May 1945.
Well, as a demographer, you should.
I'm very interested in that sort of moment in the post-war, immediate post-war period, you might say.
What is your earliest memory? I mean, not one that you think someone has told you.
Very interesting. I think my earliest memory was in the garden with my mother's father, who was tall, 6'3", had been a professional soldier, and I still have a memory of him gardening. I somehow with runner beans in the background. It must have been some of the combination of the height of this man and the runner beans. I can still remember it quite vividly.
Can you remember the flowers?
The flowers on the beans, the red flowers. Yes, interesting. And
it's quite often these early memories. There's something against the sky.
Yeah.
Trees waving.
It could have been, the sort of silhouette of him and the beans in his garden.
That's nice. At that time, I mean, well, a little later, say when you were 6, 7, 8, 9 in North Essex, were you a nature boy? I mean, what were your hobbies and interests?
Oh, like I suppose many of my primary school sort of peers, we were interested in collecting birds' eggs, much to my shame nowadays. So springtime was a very active period of looking for your more exotic eggs, because we all had egg collections that we kept, and it was quite a competitive sort of activity. Yeah, and I had two uncles who were farmers. One very close to Sybil Headingham in Witham in Essex, and another one who was a fenland farmer who'd married my mother's sisters. So there was a farming connection, and most vacations, particularly school vacations, I tried to get to one of their farms, and my uncle in North Cambridgeshire, out in the Cambridgeshire Fens, I worked for him from about the age of 10 right through my university years, every summer, helping bring in the harvest, something which I'm sure again was influential.
Well, I was going to say, someone who studies medieval agrarian economic history and so on, it seems this might have been an interest that spread into that.
Yeah, I think having a feel for the agricultural seasons and the sort of difficulties of managing the environment, even in 20th century sort of farming technology, could have been helpful.
Yeah.
You'd asked me about whether I was a nature boy. I suppose also North Essex really with fairly intensely cultivated landscape. I mean, it's an area of farming where there's not much wild or at least untrained vegetation. But my memory is we always tried to get into the river valley and the River Cone. So that was an area we spent a lot of time sort of damming sort of streams that fed into the Cone, or in those days, I mean, watching or looking for otters, and fishing in one of the mills. I mean, again, there were at least 2 old Domesday Book mills that are still there, that had mill ponds that we fished in. So that was something I still have sets of photographs of myself and friends sitting around this mill pond.
Perch and pike and things.
That's
like
right, yeah, perch and pike and
chub.
And of course the minor sticklebacks that used to sort of be netted out.
Lovely. It sounds a nice childhood. And you went to a primary school just nearby?
I went to a Church of England primary school in the village, and I still have quite vivid memories. I mean, this was a school that must have been built very soon after the 1870 Education Act, so it had a very Edwardian, if you like, or late Victorian Edwardian feel. We still had great coke stoves in the classrooms to heat what were not terribly well well-equipped classrooms, and I have again a vivid memory of the smell of coke burning in the mornings, where I think the head teacher must have stoked up these coke fires during the winter, and it's a very I think memorable sort of odour, I think, of coke burning, particularly as we frequently, if we arrived wet, having walked through the rain, the head teacher would then hang our clothes around on railings around this coke fire. So the combination, I think, of wet clothes drying with the coke, I think, sort of pervaded these classrooms. I mean, during the winter, and of course it was still 11+ days, so
So you took the 11+.
Took the 11+,
and that's how you got into the grammar school.
I went into the local, a small country grammar school in
Well, tell me about that, because for those watching, I have a particular interest in Earlscone. So tell me about Earlscone at that time in the grammar school.
Well, it was a small grammar school. It only had about 180 pupils, probably a sixth form of about a dozen. 6 in the upper and 6 in the lower. 6 each in the classes, I suppose, were about 25, 30.
Just behind the church, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just behind the church in York Road, as you're coming down the main thoroughfare. And of course, we did do all the things that you'd expect. We had carol services in the church at Christmas. In fact, the head teacher was a Downing man, a man called James Sykes, who'd been there since about 1934, when I went in 1957. No idea that I'd end up in Downing College, and I tried to find his record in the college archive, and there was barely anything about him, so I never really discovered much. But it was a good grammar school, I think, in retrospect. I mean, the quality of the teaching, I think, was very high. I mean, there were only 11 members of staff. Half of them were Oxbridge graduates, so again, I was very lucky in that regard. And it had a boarding house.
You did?
A small boarding house, so there were about 30 boarders. The rest of us were day boys. And having the boarders in the school, I think, again, made the place more interesting than it would have been otherwise. It meant that things went on in the school all the week, every day in the week, and there were quite a lot of activities after conventional school hours. So it wasn't the standard sort of, or bog standard grammar school in that regard. And as a result of that, there were two teachers who lived in, one being Ernst Wangerman, the history teacher, and he had a huge library, I remember. Well, at least to me it looked like a very large library. It probably wouldn't now, but and he would frequently ask boys to go into Colchester, I remember, to borrow books during school hours. He would send them off on the bus, and they would come back from the public library, where for some reason they were able to use his ticket. But no, I slightly regretted the fact that as I got older, the range of subjects that a small country grammar school of that size was able to offer was not very, very broad. But
what did you do?
Well, I mean, I did for my O levels, the standard mixture of Latin, French, English language, literature, and art, religious education, I think I took, and physics, chemistry, and maths. I think that was, and I wasn't sure at the age of 16 what A levels I would take. I ended up taking history, geography, and French, and in the end, I think that was okay. I enjoyed them, but.
Were there any other sort of extracurricular things that you were enthusiastic about?
I got quite involved in school drama. I did more of that as I got into my sort of what would have been 4th and 5th year. I was a very keen cricketer.
Were you? Are you still?
I still am, and now that I've had 2 cataract operations, minor though they are, I can now see the ball again. It was always difficult to play cricket with that visual impairment. When I was in Oxford, I used to play for the Trojan Wanderers. Jack Pohl, do you remember? Who was professor of American history. He had a a team that were all supposedly made up of Berlioz enthusiasts. So they'd somehow went. So I played that, and I played also with someone who you'd know very well, who was a very, very good cricketer, colleague of mine in All Souls, Robin Briggs. Another Essex lad who grew up in Braintree and Colchester. So cricket's always been quite important to me as a sort of an outlet. I'm not very athletic, but there's something cerebral about cricket, and the pace is about right, and the kind of strategies. Playing a cricket match is a bit like writing an academic paper. But at school, that was one of my enthusiasts, and I've only recently reconnected with my old cricket master, who still lives in the town of Houston, just not very far from where I now live, and he was the geography teacher as well. I think frequently the case that geography teachers and games players went together in those days, and it's been quite interesting talking to him about all the teachers that who taught me that he knew, and what he thought they were really like behind the scenes. Is always an intriguing sort of opportunity to get beneath the surface with these people, so some of the people who I thought were remarkably fine, upstanding citizens turned out to be quite different. When you get to know them. But it was an interesting. I mean, I living in Hedingham and going on the bus every day, about 8 miles to Earl's Combe, was sort of a kind of ritual that we went through in those days.
Was Reuben Hunt and the work?
Yes, so Reuben Hunt was then the chairman of the governors at Earl's Combe, and of course, you may know, of course, he lived in Cone Priory, yes. And where the Hunt family obviously had done very well for themselves. Yes, and
was the works still?
Yes, the works were still fully operational, and it gave Earl's Combe a rather interesting sort of industrial air at the time, because there were terraced houses where a lot of the men who worked in the foundry lived, and they came out of the foundry looking rather black and in their overalls. I mean, it's not the sort of thing you normally expected to see in a North Essex town. Well, North Essex in that regard had some rather interesting anomalies, because Halstead had a textile firm. Courtauls were there, and there were textile mills where my mother worked, incidentally, before she married, and then when she married she stopped. She was a weaver, a silk weaver,
really?
And during the war weaving silk for parachute. But again, there were these little sort of leftovers really from. I don't know how Reuben Hunt's foundry emerged. I should know that, but of course, Courtaulds' presence in Halstead and Braintree and Bocking were quite important sort of soppers up of surplus labour in this relatively impoverished area in the early 19th century, when they moved out of East London.
It's an interesting sort of mirror 4 centuries later of the new draperies coming into that area.
Yes, it's a kind of
with the same sort of people, Dutch kind of.
Yeah, absolutely. These Dutch sort of Huguenot sort of or Huguenot families. I mean, Courtaulds, of course, continue to be important right up until the 1970s as textile sort of firms in the community. So again, there was a sort of connection, and I remember when the former professor of economic history here, Donald Coleman, wrote a great 3-volume history of the Courtaulds, which I think enabled him to buy a very substantial sort of manor house in Cavendish, not very far from where I live now. And there are a couple of pages showing the wage books of weavers in the late 19th century. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was also a weaver there in the 1880s and 90s. And there's a page with her name, Emily Brett, sort of there. I remember telling him about this. He didn't believe it, but so.
He was a cynical man.
Yeah.
Just finally, really, on the school. Well, 2 things. One is you mentioned Berlioz, and that wasn't your choice for perhaps, but was music at all important? It
was important, because the head teacher, who was a classicist, was very, very keen on music, good pianist, and I played piano in a very rudimentary fashion. I didn't take up any other instrument, and we didn't have a piano at home, so it was always difficult for me to practice in the way that I would have liked. I wish I had been able to develop it. But James Sykes, this head teacher, was very encouraging, and he was also very keen on developing school choir. And I like to sing in a choral context. I have a sort of half-baked tenor voice, which
have you continued?
No, regrettably. When I was an undergraduate, I should have done this, but I think I was too much of a swot. Really, I got too involved in academic things. And
what about listening to music?
Oh, I really like to listen to music, and I mean, I presume I have a very conventional set of likes and dislikes. I mean, I particularly like Bach. I like the complexity of Bach, and I'm also very romantic, so I do like Slavonic composers who send me into sort of distant places. And do
you think any of the music feeds into your work? Some people say that they listen to music, and I mean Maitland, for example, it's been suggested that you can detect the sound of Wagner or other music in his writing, and he used to listen to music while he was writing.
I don't know. I'm not a great stylist, and there's a sort of complexity to my sentence structures which might perhaps reflect Bach somewhere, but I don't know. that would be a sort of one way of thinking about it. I can listen to music and write. It may mean that I'm not listening as carefully as I should be, but and I also have in the last 15 years become very interested in jazz. I mean, I regularly go to a jazz club now, at least once a month, which is something I didn't know I would ever sort of take up. But again, I like jazz piano for the same reason. It's complexity. There's I think a lot that's similar between intricate jazz playing and listening to Bach in its various forms, really.
The other thing is that around 16, most people in such circumstances get confirmed. I don't know if you were.
I was.
And which opens up the whole question of religion, because it's sometimes the time one questions one's traditional.
It's an interesting issue here. I mean, my father, a socialist, was also a kind of one of these Anglican socialists. I mean, he thought there was he thought there was something fundamental about I suppose the ideas all associated with Jesus Christ and his socialist leanings. And I'm not sure whether I did. I probably went through the motions, unfortunately, just to please my father, of getting confirmed and going to church. I suppose during my teens, at least to morning service every Sunday. Really.
But after that?
After that, really, once I went into my sixth form, I was already resisting it. But I suppose I'm very, very conventional in that regard. I'm a non-believer, but I still find sitting in a medieval church a sort of quasi-spiritual sort of experience.
Earlscombe is a nice church, isn't it?
Very nice church. And where I live in Clare,
it's a lovely church.
We have, and I do like to listen to music in churches. I mean, there's something called the Suffolk Villagers Festival, which I think is run out actually at the University of Essex, but they have regular Baroque music sort of concerts in the churches of Polstead, Hadley, Stoke-by-Nayland, and it's just a marvellous way to go and listen to Baroque music. I sometimes have sort of sensations when I'm in the church that get the better of me, I think.
Yeah, sort of Wordsworthian moments.
Yeah, right.
So you're not violently hostile to religion in the Dawkins kind of...
No, I'm not.
way.
I'm not at all. And I suppose that's one reason why I have great sympathy for Martin Rees this last week or so, for those reasons as well. But
this is a reference to the his winning of a large prize for religion and science. Okay, well, you must have, the geography, history were moving you towards that direction.
Yeah.
And was any university an obvious choice? Or?
not really. I mean, my school didn't have much of a reputation for sending people to either Oxford or Cambridge. The deputy headmaster's son, I think, went as a chemist. And James Sykes said that, well, you won't get into Oxford or Cambridge, but you might get into University College London. You know, it's a sort of next best thing, or whatever it was. And I didn't really know whether I wanted to do geography or history. I got an interview to read geography at University College London, and it was odd. I knew nothing about the department really in terms of its qualities or the people there, but I was interviewed then by the head of department, who was then Clifford Darby.
Oh yes, from King's.
From King's, although he came back to King's when he moved to Cambridge. And this would have been I suppose it was the winter of '65. I went up in obviously October of '65. But I did not know that he was a distinguished historical geographer, that he was a doomsday scholar. And I really didn't know what historical geography was. It was not something that the A-level curriculum introduced you to. But it was, I think, fortunate because it ensured that I kept my history and geography in some kind of active form as an undergraduate geographer, and I became more and more interested in the historical, if you like, economic historical.
You got into University College?
Yeah, I got into University College, and Darby gave a heavily choreographed, I might add, set of lectures that the whole of the University of London, so to speak, used to come to in UCL on the making of the English landscape. And of course, he had a competitor in W.G. Hoskins.
Yes, I was going to ask
at the time
what the relationship was.
Well, Hoskins, I think, was fundamentally more interesting because he was a more interesting human being. But there was something about Darby's approach. He certainly did bring things in the landscape and the settlement geography, place name studies, and the early sort of work he did on the distribution of serfs in the Domesday Book alive to me, and of course you could relate to it quite quickly because if you came from East Anglia, I mean, there were certain distinctive features about the Domesday geography of East Anglia, which again made it interesting to me. I could see how what he was doing did have an influence, and I remember we had a seminar where we had to present papers on key source materials. This would be in the second year, and this would be 1966, and I was assigned the parish register to write about. And it so happened that, of course, in that year, Tony Wrigley and Peter Laslett were giving lectures on the old third programme,
about family reconstitution.
That's right. 1966 was when the Introduction to English Historical Photography was published, and I bought a copy. And you may remember it had a vivid red cover with black type on it, and I gave this presentation, and I don't think Darby, who was running the class, had even seen the book. It just so happened that I strolled across the road to Dillon's bookshop opposite, and got a copy, and he must have been quite taken aback by this. But I said the only reason I knew about it was because I'd heard Peter Laslett on the third programme talking, and in the same series, Tony Wrigley gave an early version of the Importance of London paper, that very, very influential paper, again, which struck me as very interesting. And of course, he was introduced as a lecturer in geography at the University of Cambridge, but having collaborated with Peter Laslett. And so it seemed to me to think, oh, that's quite interesting that a geographer could be doing this kind of, not that I knew at the time that he'd also got a first in history from Cambridge, so he really was more than just a geographer. And then I went to a dinner, a Geographical Society dinner, where I sat next to a very exotic character who had just come to UCL, a man called Paul Wheatley.
I know.
And he'd been at Berkeley, and I was sitting next to him, and he said he thought the only interesting thing that was going on in British history at the time was what Peter Laslett was doing. And I thought, well, it's quite interesting that this rather exotic, who again was very influential. I mean, he was working then on the religious underpinnings of urban origins in China, and he had worked on similar issues in Southeast Asia. A book he wrote on the Caronese, but he wrote this book, The Pivot of the Four Quarters, which was an attempt to sort of bring Fousteau de Coulanges into sort of prominence, and the whole. And he introduced me to Karl Polanyi and that sort of dimension of economic anthropology. I remember as an undergraduate, because he was very interested in the whole question of how, as he put it, the shift from redistributional to reciprocal to redistributional arrangements would underpin urban growth, and he was trying to sort of fit this to, I think, Chinese evidence, and this again struck me as very, very interesting, and the sort of thing that I wasn't really being exposed to in any other context in my undergraduate curriculum. I'm not even sure whether it's the sort of thing you would have come across in a more conventional historical or even anthropological setting at the time. So he was really quite important, and he was trying to persuade me by the time I was graduating to go off to the University of Sheffield to learn Japanese. So he thought that really I ought, because he knew I had an interest in population related matters, and he knew enough about the quality of the Japanese sort of record, and I don't think Hayami had started sort of his pioneering work in Japanese registers. But he said, well, you could make yourself a name for yourself. I mean, if you go and work on these Japanese sources, because nobody else will be, and you've got to spend, like I did, X years on this. But of course, I wanted to work on medieval topics, and Darby moved from University College London to take the chair here in 1967. And I graduated in '68 and came to work with him as a postgraduate student.
You say, of course, you wanted to work on medieval.
Well, I'm jumping the gun here. It was just that, I mean, Darby's work on things like the medieval Fenland and the reconstruction of the sort of characteristics of the population distribution, settlement geography of the Fens, and having spent a lot of my youthful vacations in fields in about 12 miles from Ely, looking at the cathedral looming across this landscape as we were, bringing the harvest in. It did sort of draw me in a way, and I was always interested in issues to do with why the Fens were so prosperous in terms of their underlying sort of income per capita. You looked at the lay substitution, you saw this area which looked in principle to be bereft of people having such high per capita income, so I came up, but I wanted to work on North Essex and Suffolk. Again, I was interested in the early development of the textile industry. I'd read Joan Thirst's essay on industries in the countryside as an undergraduate, and her ideas about the links between particle inheritance and the fragmentation of holdings and the development of industry as a by-employment. I thought, well, I wonder whether this can be made to work in North Essex and South Suffolk, and I discovered that, of course, this wasn't an area of particle inheritance at all. It was an area where, as far as I could work out, it was primarily primogeniture. But so I spent a year with Derby, trying to map fulling mills as indicators of industrial development along the rivers Colne and Stour. I still have of these rather rudimentary mapping exercises that I went through, but I got really very bored with that kind of static sort of.
You got to see some lovely Constable paintings, but
yes, but it so happened that I alighted on a manor where I'd found part of an inheritance in the British Library, a place called Rickinghall, and it was an old manor of it was a manor of the Bury St Edmunds estates, and I was having really to teach myself to read manorial documents, because within the geography department there was very little formal training in these sorts of things. I doubt there would have been much in the history faculty actually if I'd been there either, but I got to
wasn't John Saltmarsh know how to read?
Oh, John Saltmarsh was a figure who I think Clifford Derby rather revered, and he thought that I wasn't really the kind of material that should be sent to John Saltmarsh. I did go to the university reader in paleography, who was a fellow of no college. He was a reader. I can't remember his name now. But he had a room in Laundress Lane, and he taught paleography to anybody who wanted to go. But he was a purist again, in the sense that he thought that we all needed to know everything about Carolingian minuscule. So he sat at the end of this very long railway carriage of a room with a box of letters, and he would pull this out, it's the Carolingian A, and we go. Then sort of after about 3 weeks, we'd be given a piece of a facsimile to try to translate. It was impossible. T.A.M. Bishop was his name. I mean, he was quite distinguished in his own way, and left me completely, I think, without any technical skills. But those were interesting days. I don't know any of the medievalists that I was being exposed to Carolingian minuscule with. Whatever happened to them? But
Arthur Hibbert was, of course, a major
Arthur Hibbert was here,
yeah,
and he was giving lectures on urban issues. And the only person who was really interested in what I was doing was Poston. Yeah. And I still remember him summoning me after I told him about told Tony Wrigley what I was doing, and Tony had passed this information on to Poston. He summoned me to Peterhouse, and you probably remember him too. He said, "Smith, geography is a good subject to begin with, but it's even better subject to get out of." And I don't think I really took him seriously at the time, but there was a sort of element of that about it all.
What was Derby like as a supervisor? He was supervising your PhD.
Yeah, he wasn't really very interested in the kinds of questions I was trying to address, because they were sort of dynamic and they didn't translate into sort of geographical patterns. In other words, I was looking at processes really of social behaviour, and they wouldn't convert into the conventional sort of mapping routines that he wanted. So it was a difficult relationship for about a year and a half, and then he said, well, your interests, particularly when I gave him a piece that I'd written on the relationship between inheritance and subsequent land marketing of the sons, as to what they did with the land afterwards. And he said, well, this is really not in any sense historical geography as I know it. So he said, you better go and talk to Tony Wrigley. And Tony Wrigley then said, well, I can't really supervise this kind of stuff because he was in the geography department then. He said, but I have this young colleague who's working with me, Roger Schofield, who can read anything and did work on medieval taxation as well as Tudor taxation. Was
he still at the Public Record Office?
No, he just arrived and was working in the population group in 1967. And he had been working in the Public Record Office up until that point. And he took me on. And
it was a wonderful supervisor.
It was a wonderful, fortuitous, sort of link, really, that I think in that respect I'm terribly grateful to Derby for kicking me off his patch, really, because
Well, tell me about Roger, because
Roger,
I went to interview him. I think.
You came to Cambridge first in 70. Yeah, Roger.
71.
Roger was a very exotic character because he dressed.
I remember seeing the advertisement for the post in the Institute of Historical Research. And I was already working on documents. I thought, well, perhaps I'll apply for this, and I didn't. And then realising how much better Roger would be at any such job than I could possibly have.
Well, he was. I mean, I'd read his paper on the geographical redistribution of wealth, which I think he published based on his Cambridge PhD. But he was quite exotic. He was married to an actress who was a beautiful woman. I mean, and he lived in London and commuted to Cambridge every day on the King's Cross line, as it was then, when you had to change, I think, at Hitchin before getting it. So, and I was living I was at St Catherine's. I was in a St Catherine's hostel on Panton Street, and he would cycle through en route from the station to. So I'd seen him before I became his supervisor. Cycling from the station to the old Silver Street.
He had a rather racy bike, I think.
He did, and he often used to wear a kind of
neck chief.
A neck chief, that's right, a red and white spotted one. And he wore blue denim sort of trousers and top. So he wasn't the sort of average academic sort of to look at in those days. And of course I think he mixed with a rather interesting sort of theatrical set in London when he went back in the evenings. But he was just remarkable. I mean, he immediately saw the value of the material I was working on and encouraged me. I thought it was a risky sort of encouragement in some senses, because there was no way in which it was clear how I was going to convert all this into something at the end of the day. And then, of course, I went to. I needed to look at some more material which had been sold to the University of Chicago. It was part of the Nicholas Bacon collection, and the University of Chicago bought one of the key manors that I wanted to work on, Redgrave, in North Suffolk. Rickett and Manley, the people who were editing Chaucer at the University of Chicago, decided at some point in the 1920s that they wanted to teach their graduate students to read English courthand, so these documents came up for sale and they bought them. So this meant that the whole thing sort of ended up in the University of Chicago. No one worked on them apart from one woman called Sylvia Thrupp. And I went, but I got married to
Peggy.
In rather rapidly.
She was the archivist.
She was the archivist. Yes, it was, and
instant access to the archives.
I know. But I did have privileged access at all hours of the day, which was tremendously helpful. And in a sense, pursuing this manor in North Suffolk that no one had really worked on. I mean, I suppose again changed my life to a certain extent, because I wouldn't have gone to Chicago. I wouldn't have had an American wife, but we came back. I mean, very soon thereafter. I suppose that would have been when I came back to Cambridge in the early 70s. I just finished my PhD. I did have a period when another quite interesting medieval demographic historian acted as a sort of temporary supervisor while I was away, a man called David Helly.
Yes.
Yes, he was then at the University of Wisconsin, about an hour's drive up the freeway from Chicago, and he was working on the great Florentine catasto, that great project, which was very interesting, and it gave me an opportunity to look at some Southern European sort of evidence and a very different type of social structure, which helped me to sort of, I think, firm up my ideas about the distinctiveness of English patterns, which were entirely unlike the things that he was talking about. And he realised it too, and encouraged me, I think, to sort of go out a bit on a limb with that, because he'd never seen English manorial documents, and he'd never seen them analysed in the way that I was sort of doing. And I think again that was rather lucky to have encouraged him in that way. Unfortunately, he moved on to Harvard, and I didn't really keep in touch with him. Then he died rather early. I mean, he got cancer quite young, and didn't really carry on doing the work that he was doing. But it was an interesting episode, really.
What was the central theme of the thesis?
The central theme, I became very interested in the relationship between inheritance, intergenerational population growth, and social networks, because, I mean, I'd read Hohmann's on partible inheritance, and he was quite convinced that partible inheritance led to rather complex extended family structures where you had frequently married brothers sort of either living together or living very close together, and that the fragmentation of holdings led to these structures that were very, very different from the areas where you had primogeniture and a more stem family type arrangement. So these were two sort of stereotypes really that were dominant in the literature on English peasant society, and I suppose they had a wider presence in writing about European behaviour generally. But Hohmann's never really looked at what happened to the land after the brothers had inherited, and it became quickly apparent, that they were buying and selling, and often one brother emerged as the dominant landholder, and the rest either went off as labourers or did something very different. So there was no really strong family attachment to the land, and that's, I think, what interested me at the time, and also trying to build up the sorts of social networks that these individuals created. You could do this with the manorial court records in a way that would have been very difficult to undertake with other sources. So I think I was trying to show, first of all, that the partible inheritance driver for industrial growth and a distinctive type of social outcome didn't work. The reality was very, very far removed from the theory. So that was really an attempt to look at an inheritance sort of driven approach to social structure, which I didn't find terribly persuasive in that form. And of course I got very, very interested in the operation of the peasant land market, or the rural land market, broadly defined. I suppose that's when I met you, really, very soon thereafter.
It was around that time.
Yeah.
What about the extended family theory of Hohmann's? Did you find evidence of extended families?
It was very, very hard to find the sort of arrangements that were very durable. I mean, I found some evidence, obviously, of maintenance contracts where elderly parents were at least given space on the farmstead to coexist with their children, but they didn't, in my view, appear to be terribly persuasive evidence of them actually co-residing. I mean, the contractual basis of the relationship, the spatial arrangements, the fact that the frequent clauses setting up means by which they might have access to use the kitchen or access to the well and things, suggested that co-residing was not the underlying arrangement that sort of drove this pattern. So I suppose at the time I just become a very sceptical sort of observer on these on these patterns that had a kind of prominence in the literature, and of course it was helped enormously by the fact that I was fortunate enough to get a university, in those days, a university assistant lectureship in historical geography, demography, in 1974, when Tony Wrigley gave up his post in the geography department to have a full-time appointment with then the Social Science Research Council with the Cambridge Group. I remember giving a paper in a seminar that Peter Laslett then ran in Trinity in the evenings. You probably went to some
of those, yes.
And he was very, very interested. I know it was actually a paper about illegitimacy, because I found some very interesting information in these manorial documents about women who were giving birth outside of wedlock, and I was trying to relate them to the number of fines that were being paid for marrying, so I could get some kind of a ratio of illegitimates to marriages. It was quite wrong, and I know it was mistake in trying to do it that way. But Peter was very interested in this at the time.
Had he started his work on illegitimacy by then?
He certainly published the first paper with Carlo Ostavine on illegitimacy. So he was interested in these ratios, and he said, well, they look very similar to the sorts of ratios that you would find if you plotted marriages and bastard births in late 16th century England. And I didn't really think very much of that point. But John Heinel was also in the audience, and he said something to me about, well, can you really get at patterns of peasant marriage in these documents? He was spending a year here.
He'd already written the famous paper.
Yeah, he had, and I knew that article. I mean,
European marriage pattern.
And I said, well, I think you can, although it could be quite tricky. And then later, a few months later, they advertised a post for a research officership in the population group, and I thought, this is really too good an opportunity. I mean, I know I have a university position at the moment. It could be rather chancy taking the risky sort of step to go into a research post, but I got appointed. I know that David Levine was one of the other people who was in for that post at the time. And I thought he would get it because he'd done a conventional family reconstitution and had all of the skills. But obviously Peter and Tony just thought that this might be more interesting to develop the group's interest in that area, and I was very, very, very lucky. And I suppose you were then running a seminar, and I don't know how it came about. It was certainly before English individualism.
Yes.
That you invited me to give a talk here.
Because between about 72 and 74, I was running a seminar in King's.
Yeah, it was in 74. It was my first year here, and I gave a paper on network analysis.
Yes, you did.
And John Barnes was gave me a bit of a rough time, but he was very, very interested in it, and we spoke a lot about it subsequently. And because I was using techniques that he had really pioneered himself in that, and it must have been after that either you read my thesis or I gave you some bits of it. Or
I read it.
Right, and well, then I got more interested, not so much in the manorial documentation. I got interested in trying to look for evidence of late marriage and low incidence marriage in other sources. So, and I went back to sort of reconsider the poll taxes, and that took up quite a lot of my time in the late 70s.
Well, this is a question which we may delete from the record, but I remember your thesis was terribly important as a background, and your other work as background to my book on English individualism. I remember when it came out, there was quite a bit of hostility from a number of Marxist and other historians. And I remember saying, some of them said that, one or two critics wrote saying that you would have never allowed such a thing to have come out and me to use your work if you'd known what I was going to do and so on. But the thing that interested me was I asked you why you hadn't written my book, because you had all the information, you knew that most of what I was attacking was wrong. And you said, well, you're an outsider. I'm slightly paraphrasing. You're an outsider. You don't have PhD students who are dependent on jobs with these people, and so on and so on. You can say this. It's more difficult for me, right in the middle of the profession, to come out in such a radical way.
Yeah, I think I remember that conversation, and it was. I think if you were, so to speak, in the middle of a group of researchers who would never have sort of made those sorts of claims, or indeed really were never willing, I think, to interest themselves in quite that form. They would have thought that I was pushing the evidence beyond the point that it could really legitimately be taken. And I'm still very sympathetic to a lot of what you were doing with it, because it would be very, very difficult, I think, to have pursued the kinds of interest that I've had subsequently within the group if I were not fundamentally supportive of that underlying view, because it did require one to sort of to start to look at what was actually happening rather than assuming that things should take a particular form if they're going to abide by any kind of sort of evolutionary development. And of course, Poston was never really fully persuaded, and I think partly because of the diagnosis that you, to some extent, made in English individualism or somewhere else. I mean, another Russian.
Well, there's names like Titov, Poston, Homans,
Kosminski,
Kosminski, Vinogradov.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that we had these very, very eminent and very able people of East European sort of origins who brought that baggage into their interpretation of medieval England. There was no question about it. So they would have found it very, very hard. I always found it, though, very difficult to understand why as economic historians at the time, even though Domesday scholars revered Maitland, that they didn't really read Maitland and didn't really sort of take him on board in the context of thinking about other features of the social structure. It was a very interesting a kind of absence from the from the literature and discussion. I mean, you rarely, and of course, for the most part, these people did not interest themselves in the law either. I mean, you had to sort of subscribe to the view that customary law, as it was supposedly enacted and practiced in the manorial courts, was a very different animal from anything that came out of the common law courts, and it quickly became apparent that it wasn't. I mean, that interested me quite a lot for a period after that. I got involved in helping to establish a new legal history journal, the Law History Review, that was then being sort of run out of Cornell, which again seemed odd for anybody who was sort of historical geographer, demographer, and a sort of kind of early family historian. So the customary law and common law sort of issues continue to interest me. I still sort of dabble in those sorts of areas, and of course Hilton had been so adamant that the common law and manorial law were so different animals that they were never part and parcel of any kind of continuum, that it was impossible to have a kind of constructive dialogue with him on those matters. I suppose you would also remember sort of difficult relations with someone like Hilton.
Very, I do.
At the time.
Yep. Okay, you were just saying something further about the reaction of...
Yes, I mean, the reaction of, I think, a lot of people on the left to my material that you were familiar with and using as part of your argument, was tricky because they realised that this was very carefully researched. I mean, it wasn't empirical analysis that was fragile in the way in which it had been put together. And oddly enough, I mean, the methodologies that I'd then developed for working with manorial court rolls were picked up by Hilton because he got a substantial grant in those days, which was in the old Social Science Research Council, to do more work on the exploitation of court rolls. So, and I just don't think that would have happened had the interest that you had, I think, generated in debate about the nature of English medieval social structure, particularly rural social structure. Because I remember Michael Anderson, who was then, I think, on the research board of the ESRC, he read my thesis, because it had been submitted, I think, as part of Hilton's case for getting quite a large grant to do a big survey of manorial court rolls. And of course I'd used some, probably wouldn't do it now, I'd used some sort of exchange theory to try to look at why brothers stayed together, or why certain people interacted in the court in a particular way. It was partly stimulated by the way in which he'd used it to look at family relations in 19th century Preston, which I suppose is a sort of rather cavalier way of going about things. I was interested in that aspect of Hohmann's work actually on exchange theory, which was very different from what he was doing when he was working on manorial sources. And he said to me that he was very supportive of that application because of what he read in the dissertation, and I didn't know him very well in those days at all. So there was sort of an irony, I think, in the fact that a centre of sort of Marxist medieval economic history and in Birmingham was to some extent getting substantial financial support as a result of I think the interest that English individuals.
My feeling is that the timing was different, because Hilton consulted me and sent.
You're probably right.
Sent his research assistants for that project to come and see me. Now, he certainly wouldn't have done that after the publication.
That's right. You're absolutely right. So, but I mean, maybe the irony comes in afterwards then, because the fact that this has been such an important sort of methodological sort of statement about the potential for court rules, then you'd got interested in the results of it. That's right. You're absolutely right, Alan. I've got that wrong.
After that, we weren't on speaking terms.
Well, I mean, my relationship with him was very difficult. I did continue to have a link through an Israeli scholar, Zvi Ratzi,
yes,
who was one of his pupils who did careful work on manorial documents, although still very much, I think, within a particular kind of Marxist framework of analysis.
He never changed his mind.
Never really, although I did subsequently produce, I wrote some things jointly with him. He became persuaded that the manorial courts did absorb common law practices, and he got quite interested with me in why manorial courts became written in the course of the 13th century, when they'd been presumably oral curial arenas prior to that date, where we were arguing that this was entirely a stimulus from the emergence of written common law proceedings, and that the precedent sort of issues became dominant, and manorial tenants wanted courts that ran along not dissimilar lines to those of the royal courts, and that there wasn't this big divide between what was going on in the royal courts and what was going on in manorial courts. So in that sense, I did have a sort of small conversion of one Marxist into thinking, I always thought slightly more realistically about the way in which, and I always found it very, very difficult to understand how Marxist historians sort of conceptualize the countryside as almost like some kind of apartheid society, where freemen and villains somehow were living in totally different sort of encampments, really, when the world wasn't like that at all.
And Maitland says in a village is a tenure as well as a thing, and many people didn't know whether they were villains or not.
Absolutely. I mean, it was actually, in many respects, sociologically highly naive, really, when you sort of take away the layers and think of how they were thinking in these ways, and they were to some extent using a kind of rudimentary class warfare approach to the whole thing, like when you get down to the essentials.
Well, it's interesting, having just lectured in China. Sorry to go off a bit, but one of the audience, the editor of the press who's publishing it, said he found it very, very difficult to swallow what I was saying, and he thought many of the audience would find the same thing, because they were brought up in the Marxist framework of medieval England. They did learn a lot about medieval England, and it ran contrary to all their prejudices, and they would need a lot of persuading to change their minds, because it was just a myth of origin of the modern world, which was deeply embedded in their consciousness.
Yes.
And it's surprising that all this came to England, of course, but so it happened. Anyway, let's move on from my self-indulgent piece.
Well, it's now, what is it, 35 years ago now? It's a long time ago.
Time has moved on. Although they often ask me whether people accept, what I said, or to what extent, and I rather brazenly and bravely say, well, people will never admit that they accept some large-ish change in their paradigm, but generally a lot of it has been absorbed, and it's just now part of the air we breathe. And is that roughly?
I suppose it is. I mean, I would say that if anything, my views have not changed, but they've shifted somewhat to focus on what I would regard as the sorts of corporate institutions that, so to speak, go with individualism. So I've become more interested in how manorial courts worked as a kind of an alternative to the family or to other kinds of relationships based upon kinship, and especially in my more recent interests have been very much sort of reconsidering the way in which the local poor law is a kind of a correlate of a highly individualized type of social system. So those two things really, and I think there are people now who, particularly early modernists, who are interested in institutions that, so to speak, sit alongside societies with very, very thinly developed or weakly developed kin structures, who accept that now. They may not accept the fact that it was older than post 1601 or post 1598, but they acknowledge and they acknowledge that these things don't just sort of begin at the end of the Elizabethan era and embed themselves later, but they have to think hard about this. And of course there are still some who think that the poor law really was just a kind of a consequence of an early modern shift in family relations. And I suppose that sort of takes you back to some of the things that you did with witchcraft in the early parts of your sort of postgraduate career. Really,
I remember we had this discussion at the time, and this is the other great deficiency of individualism, as you pointed out, which is that with individuals, if it's so individualistic, you've got to have something to complement it. And we discussed some sort of pension system, some sort of poor law provision, and so on, which I now, resting on you, assume that this is nothing to do with the Elizabethan poor law. I mean, it goes back well beyond that. Parish relief of various kinds is a medieval feature.
Well, and I think even though it's very difficult, given the nature of the evidence, to reconstruct these sorts of institutional forms, but parish guilds, manorial courts, even some of the collective arrangements that could be secured through legal devices did that. Of course, you're interested in some of Maitland's other interests in things like trusts really are all part of the same phenomenon, aren't they? I think that has shifted a great deal. But of course, you've still got people who are interested in the poor law mainly from the point of view of a kind of left-wing sort of view about the way in which it works and continues to sort of impose itself through various forms of disciplining of the poor and as their primary interest. But that doesn't interest me. I'm actually doing something at the moment. I'm trying to look comparatively at the way in which the English old poor law sort of operates as a collective institution in ways that's very, very different from what you would find in large parts of the continent, certainly in France and Italy. And of course it gives you some sort of sense of why the parish is such a strong institution, I think, in an English context as well, comparatively speaking, with much of continental Europe, where you don't have that kind of entity. So the two things, I think, link up very, very effectively.
Have you linked this at all to the system of leaving home very early, this system of servanthood, apprenticeship, going to school, which takes children out of English homes at such an early age,
I know,
and throws them on the market, and from then on they don't come home, as was pointed out.
Yeah.
And this seems a medieval feature, as we know.
I agree, and it's a very durable feature too, isn't it? I mean, I know it's always difficult to draw a major contrast, but I mean, I've always been interested in more recent years in issues to do with the ways in which young adults in Spain and Italy don't leave the home. And as a result, I mean, one of the not the only reason, but one reason why young adult unemployment rates are so high in these countries is in part because they don't enter into a kind of broader geographical labour market. They hang around home for far longer, so those features just don't go away. They have very deep historical roots, I think. No, I'm really interested in that.
And it means, as I've been lecturing in China, that children's education, in the broadest sense of education, is totally different from France, Italy, Spain, which is familistic.
Yes.
The morality, the ethics, the social attitudes are based on the family, whereas in England they're based on contractual relationship with school teachers and apprentice masters and so on and so on. So you learn to be a social being in England outside the family from 7, 8, 9, 10.
Yeah.
Even now our schools are like that, and I think you'd see a contrast with the French school.
Yeah, and the same applies to things like the extent to which people go to university in their home region or hometown, isn't it? I mean, something I know that there have been moves in the UK to try to cut costs by encouraging that kind of arrangement, but it seems to me that people like us should be telling governments that is deeply sort of hostile to something that's so deep in our historic sort of being, really, or over time, that it just...
The oldest institution in this country is the boarding school. I mean, 7th, 8th century Westminster was the first ones, and so it's going on. Anyway.
Okay.
So you joined the group. Tell me, you mention often both Tony and Peter. Tell me, well, let's start with Peter as the older one, who was a very important person in both our lives. Give me a little pen portrait.
Well, I mean, he was, I mean, everyone's sui generis, but there was something about him that was very unlike characteristics I'd seen in any other academic that I'd encountered. I mean, he was actually genuinely interested in what other people were doing. I mean, he did listen. He could be very dismissive, but there was something about his inquisitive nature which I always found very appealing, and he was particularly keen to talk to young people. There's no question about that. He was sort of exotic, really, as someone who had shifted his intellectual interests so fundamentally. I suppose you will all say he didn't when he was in his 50s. I mean, to have had that sort of...
From political science.
Yeah, and that always intrigued me, and that he could have this kind of relationship with Quentin Skinner and John Donne, who respected him from that, who probably didn't respect his other work to the same degree, and thought that it was sort of somewhat naive. So, but he was very, very encouraging. He had a deep friendship with John Heinel. They were like blood brothers over their academic interests, and Peter took notice of what John Heinel said to him. I think there was one person who Peter listened to more. It was John Heinel on what they were doing, or he was doing. But he had a very distinctive working regime. I don't think he did very much lecturing in the faculty. I mean, we ran a population history paper at Part 2 in the history faculty for a period, and on the occasions when Peter was due to lecture, I literally had to go down to his room in Trinity at about 11:30 and ensure that I could take him over and escort him to the history faculty for his lecture. But when he went, I mean, he gave this unbelievable sort of performance, and there were quite a lot of people who of a slightly younger generation who write about their experience of Peter lecturing on family history and population history. But then he would come into the population group in the afternoons. He would write at home in the morning and go into Trinity late in the morning and have lunch in Trinity. Then he would come into the group usually about 2 o'clock and stay until about 7. And he'd done his writing for the day. I mean, he always did his 2 hours in the morning. So he would wander around talking to everybody. I mean, and if you were... it was quite infuriating at times, but these conversations were memorable. I mean, and he would come into your room and sort of say, well, what are you doing? And well, have you heard this? And then there would be tea, and he would continue this. And of course, the afternoons for him were just sort of brainstorming, really. And everybody else was trying to work while Peter was going around on this routine. And he always had lots of schemes that were underway, meetings of this, and he travelled a great deal. So he came back and always tell you what was happening in sort of Tallinn or with Jean Hamel in Berkeley or something like that. But was was exceptionally, I think, important, because while the Cambridge Group continued to plough away on these big empirical projects that couldn't be rushed, the population history of England being a good example of that. I mean, Peter kept the group, so to speak, in the public eye by this high level of activity and willingness to get out there and sometimes make outrageous claims or statements. But it did enable Tony and Roger to take the time that was needed. If not, I think the funding bodies might have run out of patience. So he was a vital, I think, ingredient in this sort of mix of things. And of course, his interests in the social structure, his scepticism of certain forms of crude Marxist thinking, and I think his deep sort of appreciation of English empiricism as he saw it embodied in the work of people like Gregory King, who he regarded as sort of another form of the Cambridge Group 300 years earlier, really. And I think it's very important when one thinks about that style of research in historical social science, I think. And I've never really been able to establish quite how it was that Tony and Peter came together. If you've interviewed Tony, he may have been able to elaborate on that point, because their personalities are so different.
He was a student of Peter's.
He was, but in terms of their public persona, their reluctance to overstate anything, I mean, Tony is so different from Peter.
So they're both from the sort of not evangelical, the sort of Puritan, Methodist wing of English.
That's right. They have that in common. And of course, I suppose Roger Schofield being a Quaker too by background, even though he never looked at Quaker to me when I met him first. But that, I mean, they were very, very important, and I always feel very privileged to have been able to work with them for so long, and still with Tony, who's remarkably productive and active now as he approaches 80. But Peter was the sort of the source of so many encouragements down particular pathways that I don't think I would have ever trodden. I mean, he got me interested in bastardy. He encouraged the work I was doing on the European marriage pattern, and he got me interested in ageing to some extent as well. So I am somewhat parasitic upon his initiatives. Tony has always been the person, though, I've worried most about in terms of anything that I write of a technical, analytical character. I mean, if I don't feel I've persuaded him that it's right, I just don't feel that I've made the case in any way that's at all plausible. Much more sort of thoughtful and careful in his judgment, but extremely polite. And you never know sometimes whether he really agreed with what you were doing. He would ask you some pointed questions. I mean, I remember him examining my doctoral dissertation with Joan Thirsk in his room in Peterhouse, and Joan had lost her watch down the side of the couch, which was clearly preoccupying her for a very high proportion of the viva, that she couldn't find it. But Tony was ploughing away with these incredibly difficult questions that he kept throwing at me, and I was trying to answer them while watching Joan Thirsk literally crawling under the couch, trying to find this watch that she somehow dropped. But a very interesting pair, really, to examine, and neither of them being medievalists, really, examining a dissertation that was on a medieval topic. And those qualities that I saw in that viva, Tony's always, I think, possessed, and I've seen them in action right up until last week, when I was giving a plenary lecture to the economic history conference on the Pomerantz thesis. I was looking again at demographic attributes of England and the Yangtze, and arguing that Pomerantz had got it quite wrong as far as I was concerned, and that Tony came up to me afterwards and said something like, "Are you sure you know enough about the Yangtze to make these sorts of claims about the inaccuracy of Pomerantz's original work. And I said, well, I only know what I've read, and I don't think he would have done that sort of thing. Partly because I don't think he is a kind of scholar who writes something by, to some extent, criticising what somebody else has done. I mean, that's not his sort of
there's very
mode
little
of
criticism
yes.
in many of his work.
You won't see it. You might find an occasional footnote about something, but he doesn't use it as a kind of a vehicle to launch an argument. And but then he told me he thought I was right, so that was okay. but there was a sort of sense in which I know he would never have approached the issue in that in that way. But he continues to be a remarkable example of someone who is driven to investigate issues, and I suppose he's still very, very preoccupied with the distinctiveness of English industrial growth and change, and continue to write interestingly on it, I think.
Yes,
and he's ensured that population history, I mean, as a sort of sub-discipline, is always engaged with larger questions. That it's never been a historical demography for its own sake, and I learnt that from him in particular. And that if you're going to keep that kind of area of research activity going, you've got to ensure that it links into other bigger questions. And I think the areas of sort of historical demography that have sort of blossomed for a while in Paris, to a lesser extent in places like Berkeley and Michigan, in the United States, have lost their have really faded because they haven't engaged with these large questions. It may well be that we're very lucky in England to have the Industrial Revolution and the distinctiveness of England's sort of economic trajectory as a sort of framework for investigating these things. So it does ensure that there's always a big question to which the demography and family history in one form or another relates. But of course that ought to be a reason for a similar kind of success with East Asian sources. I mean, to some extent the Japanese do achieve a little of that, and at some point I imagine that we're going to know more about the Yangtze than we do at the moment.
Well, I've had some long conversations about it recently, but
I'm sure we will.
We'll come back to those. One of the exciting things about the Cambridge group, certainly in the 70s, was that there were other people in other related departments who were excited by what was happening there. I remember going to seminars where Geoffrey Hawthorne, for example, was a great contributor, and also Jack Goody.
Yes.
I wondered if you had anything to say, because Jack has told
I would say a lot about Jack, because I mean, Jack, in my view, I regard him as a remarkable scholar, and I'm a great fan. We don't always agree, I think, on things, but the kinds of problems that he somehow pulls out of the bag to focus on are important. And he's been always supportive of the Cambridge group. In fact, I think one of these recent volumes he devoted to the Cambridge group and to Peter Laslett, and the kinds of issues that he's focused on. I know he has rather different views about family forms in East and West, and I wouldn't subscribe to his sort of views about the reasons why we have late marriage in Western Europe, or a distinctive marriage form. But they're big questions, I think he is a kind of Max Weber of sort of the late 20th, early 21st century. I may have told you this story before, but in the Academy back in some years back, when
British Academy,
when one of the sections divided, social anthropology broke away, had its own section with geography, and then sociology, demography and social statistics, I happened to be chair of the sociology, demography and statistics section, and Peter Brown contacted me to say that Jack Goody decided he wanted to
be in your section,
have his principal section, this was the early days of email, and I sent an email out to the members of the sociology demography section to say that I was delighted that someone I regarded to be the nearest equivalent to Max Weber, working in the British establishment.
WG Ronson.
Well, I got a few surprised responses to my sort of, if you like, sort of allocation of Jack to that position. But I believed it, and I still do. I mean, I think when one looks at the corpus and the kinds of questions he's addressed, and his remarkable commitment to comparative approaches, I admire those qualities immensely, and I have always been a sort of signed-up Goody fan, really, and one hopes that there are still people around who, sustain that kind of tradition. I don't know enough about Jack's pupils to know whether there are people who really will keep that particular torch, burning or alive. But he's been very, very important. And again, it was fortuitous in the sense that he was so influential in social and political sciences and social anthropology in Cambridge at the time that the group was really sort of getting off the ground. He was very, very supportive of that period, and I think a good friend of Peter's. They
got on very well.
They were both Jonians or whatever, and that I think said a lot. And I don't know. I mean, I suppose it would be I think something about that generation's experience that they'd had during the war and afterwards.
Moses Finlay was another one.
Yeah. Yes, Moses Finlay. I still remember going to a seminar that he gave. You may have been there in Peter's rooms in Trinity when he gave a paper about whether there was senile dementia in the ancient world, based on looking at the sort of what he thought the average ages of major sort of Greek writers were when they were, and was quite convinced that they didn't have it. And there was a sort of venture into a sort of demographic analysis of the writings of figures, and Peter asked him where he had his where he got his aging evidence from. It was sort of typical Peter sort of argument. But Moses Finlay was another one of that generation, and there are lots of younger ancient historians who came out of that Finlay school and were moulded. Of course, there was Keith Hopkins here.
Yes, I was going to ask about Keith.
And Peter Garnsey.
Because I shared this room with Keith for 10 years.
Keith is another man I admire. I sort of lost a sense of his sort of where he was going and the kind of interest he had in the latter part of his career. But the work that he did, I'd say between the late 60s and the early 80s was
and Roman demography and
very good. And I still remember vividly 1981 or 2 it was that I for a number of summers I taught a graduate seminar at the Gulbenkian Institute in Wales, just outside Lisbon.
I did with Robert Rowland.
You did. You spoke in that, and for some reason I have no idea why it came about. Keith had signed up for 3 weeks for this course. You spoke in it, I remember.
Yes,
and I had Keith every day as I was giving these classes, in the class. It was frightening to have him there, but it was very good, I think, for the class, and probably very good for me. Kept me on my toes, and because he was pretty sharp.
Pretty sharp.
Yes.
Knowledgeable.
But I'd forgotten that you were a performer during that week.
So had I. Okay, well let's come back to your career and so on. You were at the Cambridge group for some years. Then you went to All Souls.
Yeah, I went to a lectureship in. There was some concern that the group was probably going to lose its funding, and this post came up in Oxford, and Tony said he thought it would probably be a good idea to move. Take the opportunity that it gave. So I did apply for it and got it. I was then in my mid-30s, so I wasn't young. Well, it was interesting. I mean, I don't think I really got historical demography off the ground in Oxford but
there were Harrison and Boyce and people like that.
Yeah, there were people in the physical anthropology group or in the biological anthropology group who were interested. Jeff Harrison was, Tony Boyce, and there were some very supportive social historians in the university who I taught with, like Paul Slack and Robin Briggs, and I taught a paper right through the period, actually, from the beginning to the end. I was there with Paul Slack on 17th century society. No, I'm not a 17th century expert in any form whatsoever. And I did the demography of social structure, family structure, part of it. Paul did poor law and towns and the other thing. And that was good. And I always found Paul very, very receptive to these sorts of issues. And he published during that period his first big book on the plague, which very heavily depended upon the sorts of methods that we were using. But for some reason I got asked to sort of take over the Wellcome Unit for the History of Medicine after I'd been there about 4 years, when Charles Webster was elected as a senior research fellow, also at the same time that Tony Wrigley was. It was a bizarre kind of moment, and I think that was a mistake. I mean, it did expose me to areas of sort of medical history with epidemiological associations that I subsequently found useful. But I always felt that the history of medicine, with the vast amount of research funding that was being made available to it through the Wellcome Trust, was investigating large numbers of questions of really no importance whatsoever. I mean, that's putting it rather strongly, but vast amounts of sort of funding was going in to support historical research of a rather mediocre significance. And I saw that. I ran that group for about 5 years and tried to move it more towards the sort of style of research that the Cambridge group undertook, collective projects where we worked together on themes. We had a good project with, in fact, now the wife of the Master of St John's.
Mary Abbott?
No, Mary Dobson.
Well, she is now.
Oh, Mary Abbott. Yeah,
so it used to be Mary Abbott.
And that was good. And one project that I still remember vividly with the then wife of Charles Feinstein, a woman called Anne Digby, which we worked on an oral history of general practice. I hadn't done any oral historical work. I mean, and so it was new to me, and I got very interested in the shift in attitudes of general practitioners over the course of the establishment of the National Health Service in 1948. People who'd been in practice pre-48, those who came in just after 48, and those who came in later, and that was just interesting methodologically to do work of that kind. We collected a vast amount of information and interviews with over 200 general practitioners, with a research assistant I had working with me then. But that was finished, and then poor Roger had his first stroke, and Tony Wrigley, having been in Oxford for about 4 years, and a colleague in the college at All Souls, came back to take the chair of economic history and the mastership at Corpus, and I think somehow he managed to persuade the history faculty that they needed to create a post to replace Roger, who had been previously paid exclusively by the Economic and Social Research Council, and I got that job and came back in '94 to run a group that was very different, because I mean, Peter was still actively engaged, even though retired formally. Roger, unfortunately, was a pale figure of his old self, even though he was still interesting to talk to, and Tony was then obviously preoccupied with running.
He was probably president of the British Academy.
He became president of the British Academy. He was master of Corpus, and I think sort of professor of economic history as well. So, but he still came in about 1 day a week. So the group wasn't the group that I had left in 1983-84, and we had now, without large-scale funding from the Economic and Social Research Council, because they stopped giving these big grants. I then had to run it really as a soft money research centre, collecting grants from all different kinds of places, but still trying to keep the interests of groups of people in rather similar related areas, it's still going. I don't think we have really big questions that drove the group during the 60s and 70s at the forefront of our activity. I mean, I don't think we've got anything equivalent to a major reconstruction of the demographic sort of history of the country. We don't have the sort of bigger projects that Peter undertook on ageing, but we still do a lot of work of a major kind, and on the demographic sort of correlates of occupational change, this huge project that we've been running over the last 4 years. I've been working, become more and more interested in the impact of large metropolitan centres on the epidemiological environments that they create and the links they have with the economies and societies around them. So London's demography is something I have been working on with a series of grants, and I think that's very, very important. And I would want to argue, and that's what I was doing in this plenary to the Economic History Society last week, that the emergence of a large metropolitan centre like London in the 17th century connected in all kinds of ways with international movements of people, goods and diseases, creates a totally new type of demographic regime in England, probably also to some extent in the Dutch Republic, that sort of sets it apart from anything that's happening in Asia at the same time. And it really creates a situation in which you can build up a very, very large number of individuals who have immunities to most of the major infectious diseases that enable adult mortality to come down in a dramatic way over the course of the 18th century.
That's your explanation for that decline, is it?
I know you've got other explanations that you have in mind, but
why hadn't it occurred in previous large conurbations in China, Italy, Spain, and so
because I don't think their trading relationships were of a comparable.
Italy had a lot of trading relationships.
Well, I don't think they were to the same extent as expansive as the ones that London managed to, I think, achieve, and indeed Amsterdam and the Dutch cities. I mean, it is a remarkable sort of development that I think really sort of takes off around about 1680, 1690, and is common to. But it's not just common to London and Amsterdam. It eventually, I think, drags in northern France and much of the southern Scandinavia and Denmark and parts of West Germany. They all sort of start moving in the same direction, even though they're very, very different economically. I think their exposure to infections, particularly as they are associated with an initial deterioration in the life chances of the very young. That's one of the other things that happens, that infants and young children get much worse mortality. But those that survive, I would want to argue, are carrying huge benefits from a previous exposure, and it shows up in the ways in which mothers transmit those health advantages to the fetus and to the early. That's one of my arguments at the moment. One of the things I'm trying to sort of develop more fully. But I mean, that would be one of the arguments against why other large urban centres don't generate that kind of epidemiological shift. It may well be that we still don't know enough about the epidemiological attributes of some of these larger metropolitan centres. I mean, we are fortunate in being able to do this with London, even with given the ways that we've been able to devise means of doing family reconstitutions on London parishes, which was thought not to be possible 20 years ago because of the high migration and turnover patterns. But and of course we've got a lot of people who are doing work on the demographic correlates of the old poor law in different forms as postdocs and postgraduate students. So I think we're still addressing big enough questions, but my fear is whether we'll be able to continue to do that in the future, and whether the funding bodies will continue to look favourably on this kind of work. I mean, as you know, the department in which the Cambridge Group is now based has just established a chair in demography, and it would, I think, depend a great deal on who gets elected to that chair as to how this whole area will develop in the next decade, I think. So,
can I just finally, just in the last 5 minutes, 10 minutes, turn to one or two other questions which I always sort of like to ask. One is about how you think, creativity, and you've made a number of major contributions, and some people are not interested, and some people don't think about it, but I've always been interested in how people write, how they work, how they organise their field notes, whether they have punch cards, whether they use computers to write on, and so, anything on writing, thinking methods that might be of use and interest to.
My method is a bit of a scattergun one, in the sense that I'm always interested in interconnections between bits and pieces that, and I write short pieces and try to organise them into some sort of more coherent form, but it's done not in the first instance as a kind of continuous piece of writing. It's done very much from the point of view of lots of bits and pieces, that a jigsaw, which I then somehow am thinking about, and in the process of trying to write in a more coherent and integrated fashion, they get merged together. It's probably not a form of writing and thinking that is advisable. I mean, because there is a sort of a bit of randomness about it as to how these things eventually sort of cohere. Or but it's partly because of the way in which I think. I'm always thinking about an interconnection between some observation I've made in reading something or finding some piece of information, that connection with something else, and then I will think, there's a bigger set of interconnections here, and I have to work it out in this very, very fragmentary way. Whereas I imagine someone like Tony Wrigley has it all worked out in his head pretty well before he sits down.
You sound much more like Jack Goody, who works like in the way you describe, I think.
Yeah, I would find it very hard to do it otherwise, and it may well because I have a sort of a little boredom threshold that sets in. Once I've played around with a little thing, I then want to play around with another little thing.
I asked Lord Rees how it was he achieved so much, and he said, I have a short attention span.
Well, there's an element of that about it. I mean, but that's probably putting too favourable a gloss on the process, I think.
And do you find you write best at a set time, in a set place? Do you go for walks? Do you write by?
I write best in the early morning and again in the early evening. I have periods in the day, particularly if I'm writing. And I tend to do most of my writing at home rather than in the office because of just too many disturbances. And I do pace around the house a lot when I'm writing. I eat a lot. I'm always munching on biscuits or, in between sort of paragraphs. It's a very restless sort of writing experience, I think I go through.
Did you enjoy it?
Oh yes. I mean, I don't find writing painful in that regard, although this sort of peripatetic sort of experience, pacing around the house, and is my wife always knows when I'm writing because I'm up and about, down for half an hour, and I'm up again and back again. But I know there are quite a lot of people who do write like that. Although I was quite surprised when I discovered. I thought there was something odd about this way of doing things, and then it couldn't really be regarded as serious because I thought serious scholars and writers who sat there and contemplated the page before them and or the screen before them for long periods and just produced it, because I think that's the way that Tony Wrigley does it.
I think it probably is. You mentioned that Peggy realised when you were munching your biscuits and wandering around you were writing, which brings us to Peggy. Do you have children? Or?
We don't have children, which is I don't quite know how that came about, really. We had plans to have children, and then Peggy decided to do a PhD in Britain rather late, in when she was well into her 30s, and then it sort of just slipped off the agenda. I think I regret it. I think I regret it.
She probably does too.
Yeah, I think we both do, because they are a great source of enjoyment, and you'd like to think that you're going to pass something on, really.
Well, there are other ways of passing.
Yeah, there are, but in a way, that may be a rather arrogant way of putting it, because you may not like what you've passed on to your children, I suppose, which is always.
And Peggy continued to work as an archivist, or?
No, she did. She got a university post. I mean, in the University of Reading when we were living in Oxford, in history of printing, because that's the area in which she worked for a PhD, and she progressed to reader in the history of printing in the Department of Typography and Graphic Communication, but then decided when she was 60 that she wanted to retire, and she retired in 2004. We had a house in Reading and a house in Cambridge, and we wanted a house that was big enough to accommodate all our books, and we decided that we would like to move out of Cambridge, and we moved back down to, well, almost to where I was born, Clare, just on the other side of the river from the Hedingham, so to speak, and she's still researching, and but very, very actively involved in the local museum, and I have, for my sins, in the last year become involved in establishing a free school in Clare. You might not regard that politically to be an acceptable activity, but the quality of secondary education in South Suffolk is low, and the local authority was closing down our secondary school, as it is this year. So a group of us decided to take advantage of the current government sort of legislation to re-establish the secondary school, which we're modelling on the sort of basis of a Cambridgeshire Village College. Three trustees, and I have been working almost 2 full days a week on this for the last 6 months, and I probably will do until we open the school formally in September. So it's a I suppose again, might not have done that if I had children, but maybe it's something that
it's another way.
Another way, right? So.
I mean, that brings us perhaps to the last question, which is about politics. You mentioned your parents were quite left-wing and organised meetings of the Labour Party and so on, and now you're taking on a project which actually is, I don't know what it is really, but anyway, it's more Cameron-ish, but anyway. But has politics been an important part of your life at all? Not actively. I've never really been actively involved in any political party as a kind of practitioner or enthusiast. I'm interested in politics. I suppose I'm deeply sceptical of a great deal of what goes as political activity. I am very keen on what I would call sort of community activity in a broader sense. And I don't mean that in a big society Cameron sense. Yeah, civil society stuff. But I am interested in civil society and the kinds of institutions that somehow bring disparate sort of bodies and individuals together, so that you have some kind of sense of social coherence. And I mean, and parties vary a great deal in the extent to which they achieve that. I mean, I don't really like big government, but I don't either like highly individualistic sort of situations where there is no intermediate level. So I'm sort of interested in political processes that enable communities to somehow function effectively. And I suppose this school is supposed to be an example of a community-led school that will provide a set of facilities for a community and its immediate sort of hinterland of small villages. Really, it's rather modest interest, but that's nice. Is there anything that you would have hoped I would have asked you, or that I have obviously missed, that's important?
Well, I suppose I wondered whether you were going to ask me about why I had somehow managed to move around between two disciplines. But although I expect you're too well informed to realise that I wasn't really doing that. It just so happened that the sorts of things that interested me could be more effectively undertaken sometimes in history departments and sometimes in geography departments. But there are some people who do regard this as a rather unusual, but you wouldn't, because of your moves between history, anthropology and everything else that you've done. And that I suppose it's because I don't really think that disciplines, when it comes down to it, are very important. But I was wondering, you asked me about the discipline as a sort of framework for undertaking or pursuing an academic career.
Study problems, not disciplines, as the man might have said, but didn't.
Yeah. But it sometimes doesn't. It's not always good for a successful career, because institutions don't like that kind of approach, do they?
No, you have to be very lucky to.
Yeah, and I've been very lucky. I have been exceptionally lucky in that regard, I think.
Well, that's a very nice note perhaps to end on, if that's okay with you.
Okay, fine.
Lovely, thank you.